If you love Rearview Mirror Chronicles podcast and want to help us keep bringing you brilliant episodes, then please share it with a friend or a fellow history fan who you think might enjoy it. Thanks for your support, and I do hope you enjoy this episode. Hello, I'm Keith Hockton. Night falls over the forests and the rivers of old North America. Somewhere in the shadows, a beaver slides into black water, oblivious to the fate it will bring, not just to itself, but to entire nations. This isn't a tale of noble traders or intrepid explorers. This is the story of how human greed, fueled by the lust for beaver fur hats in distant Europe, unleashed a storm of violence that erased whole peoples from the face of the earth. The Wendat, the Erie, the Neutral Nation, the Petun, the Susquehannock. These names once echoed across the lakes and woodlands, cultures with their own languages, ceremonies, and of course dreams. But during the Beaver Wars in the darkness of the 17th century, they were hunted, burned, enslaved, and scattered to the wind. Their villages vanished, their voices fell silent. At the heart of this storm, the Iroquois Confederacy. Armed with European muskets, desperate to control the fur trade, they launched a campaign of utter destruction. Whole nations were wiped out for the right to trade beaver pelts. The French, the Dutch, and the English stood by, profiting from the carnage, trading guns for fur, turning rivalries into blood feuds. The land itself was emptied. Beavers, once countless, were trapped to nearly extinction. The woods grew quiet, not just from the loss of wildlife, but from the silence that follows when an entire people is erased. In this podcast, I'd like to remember those vanished nations. We'll follow the trail of blood, fur, and ambition through the forests of a forgotten war. And I'll ask, what is lost when desire blinds us? And who remembers the names of those erased for the price of a hat? And ultimately, this is a podcast about beavers, how they were nearly erased, how they endured, and how they changed the land. The other thing that I think about often, and certainly through the research of this podcast, was the nations that were wiped out. I keep coming back to one sobering question. How many people actually died in the process? I didn't know. Are we talking hundreds, thousands, or something far greater? The truth is, nobody knows for certain. There were no written records kept by the indigenous nations, and colonial records are patchy at best. Most historians agree. We're not talking about a handful of deaths. We're actually talking about tens of thousands, maybe more. The direct warfare alone was devastating. There were battles, raids, and outright massacres. Entire villages erased from the map. The Iroquois campaigns against the Huron, the Erie, the Neutrals, the Petun, and the Susquehannock probably killed at least 10 to 20,000 people over a few decades. But the death toll didn't stop just with the violence. As the Europeans arrived, disease was the grim reaper behind the scenes. Smallpox, measles, and other European plagues swept through these indigenous communities that were already broken by war. In some cases, more than half a nation died, not by the musket or the tomahawk, but by sickness brought on by the breath of strangers. There was also famine, crops destroyed, people forced to flee into unfamiliar lands, starving and exposed. Some historians estimate the combined toll of war, disease, and starvation at about 30,000, maybe 50 or 60,000 lives. Others suggest the true figures could be higher, maybe close to 100,000, when you count those who simply vanished, lost to history after being driven from their homes. It's a scale of loss in Canada that's almost impossible to imagine. Whole worlds, languages, traditions, families, effectively erased at the price of a beaver pelt. No graveyards big enough, No records, just silence and the echoes of names that we now struggle to remember. Welcome to Beaver Wars. Before we dive into dusk on that quiet Canadian pond, let's pause and ask a simple question. One that opens a door, I think, into some of the bloodiest and most consequential chapters in North American history, the Beaver Wars. And why were they called the Beaver Wars? It's a strange name, isn't it? At first, it almost sounds comical. Wars fought over beavers. But in truth, the story behind that name is anything but funny. In the 1600s, the beaver wasn't just an animal. It was the currency of empires, the fuel for ambition, the spark that ignited decades of violence across vast forested continents. When Europeans arrived in North America, they brought with them an insatiable hunger for beaver pelts, what would become the essential ingredient in the world's finest hats and the hottest fashion in Paris and London. But there was a catch. There were only so many beavers, and whoever controlled the best hunting grounds controlled the wealth and the power that came with them. The Iroquois Confederacy, armed with muskets and ironware from Dutch and later English traders, pushed outwards, seeking new territories as beaver populations actually dwindled at home. This brought them head-to-head with other indigenous nations, the Huron, the Algonquin, the Erie, all trying to protect their lands, their livelihoods, and their way of life. What actually began as a struggle for survival soon became a war for dominance. And behind it all, Europeans happy to stoke the fires, if you like, eager to profit from every pelt, every treaty, and every single skirmish. So when historians actually talk about the Beaver Wars, we're not just talking about skirmishes over animals. We're actually talking about a collision of worlds, a clash driven by commerce and ambition and the relentless European appetite for beaver fur. The beaver became both a prize and a curse, reshaping entire nations, redrawing maps, and setting the stage for Canada and the North America that we now know today. And it's here in these forests and rivers, stained by struggle, that our story begins. Imagine yourself at the edge of a pond at dusk. Not a postcard pond, not a tame one, but the kind that lives in memory, the kind that breathes. It could be a pond in the cold blue shadow of the Laurentians, somewhere in Quebec, or a half-hidden waterway meandering through New England woods, or a moss-edged pool in the heart of Devon, England, where autumn hangs heavy and the land is old. Here, the air is charged with the cool twang of water and leaves. Shadows bleed across the ground. You crouch among the reeds. The water stretches before you, perfectly still, reflecting a bruised sky fleckled with orange and indigo. The world has narrowed to sound, the faint ticking of crickets, the sigh of wind, the distant, secret splash of something wild. It is at this hour, when the light falters and the land draws its breath, that you first see it. First, a ripple, so slight you wonder if you imagined it, then a shape, brown, purposeful, moving low through the water. There's nothing hesitant about it. This animal moves as if it belongs to the dusk, to the quiet. It glides, then stops half in shadow, eyes glittering. Then suddenly, whack! The surface erupts, a broad, flat tail slaps the water, cracking the silence. The sound rolls across the pond and bounces off the trees, as much as a warning as an announcement. This is claimed land, an ordered world in a wild space. You're not alone, and in a sense, you never were. Welcome to the revolution that no one saw coming, because what we're about to witness is not just the life of a curious rodent, but the actual unfolding of one of nature's great dramas. I'm speaking not about mascots or passport stamps. I'm talking about the beaver, a survivor, a builder, a living contradiction. This creature has built empires and toppled them, fueled fortunes and destroyed them, vanished almost entirely, and with stubborn defiance, returned to shape the world anew. Now, set aside everything you think you know about beavers: the comic tale, the paddle silhouette, the polite Canadian symbol. The real story is older, stranger, and at its heart, I think a story actually about us as well, about what we build, what we destroy, and what we are willing, I suppose, at last, to restore. To understand the beaver, we need to step not just back in time, but into deep time. Picture North America at the end of the last ice age. The world is raw and immense. Glaciers still retreat in the north, leaving behind a patchwork of incredible lakes, forests, wild, silent rivers. The land actually teems with life. Herds of woolly mammoths, shuffling mastodons, saber-toothed cats moving ghost-like in the dust. And among them, the beaver's ancestor, the giant Castoroides. Imagine a creature the size of a bear, over 2 meters from nose to tail, with teeth as long as a man's hand and a jaw designed to chisel wood and bone alike. These were not animals to be trifled with. Their presence shaped the land, digging, wallowing, carving out burrows in the riverbanks, leaving tracks the size of dinner plates along the shore. Castoroides didn't build dams as we know them, but they were part of that ancient web of life that left the land changed. I'd say richer, wilder, and certainly more complex. But as the world warmed and the ice withdrew, these giants faded, overtaken by change, by competition from nimbler cousins, perhaps also by the first human hunters who crossed from Asia. And so, as the old world vanished, a new engineer took the stage. The modern beaver. Smaller? Yes, absolutely, but astonishingly creative, incredibly persistent. Here was a mammal that did not just live in the land, but altered it. One stick, one dam, one midnight hour at a time. And let's just pause here because the story becomes both intimate and I think also grand. Watch a beaver at work and you see not chaos, but order. The animal actually scouts its territory with a craftsman's eye. Is the stream running too fast, too slow? Is the pond too shallow? Do we have to deepen it? Are trees standing proud and straight? Bring them down, gnaw through the trunks, drag them, heavy as they are, by sheer determination. In a matter of days, what was one simple trickle becomes a complete construction site. It's astounding. And it's not just vanity, it's survival. By creating a pond, the beaver actually makes a fortress, safe from wolves, coyotes, and bears. Its lodge with underwater entrances is nearly impregnable. And as the world freezes in winter, that deep pond stays open beneath the ice. An effectual larder of branches and bark stored for hungry months. Yet what emerges is not just a beaver's haven, but a world remade for countless others. The pond is actually alive. Frogs trill, herons stalk the shallows, otters play along the banks, insects and fish dart through the channels that didn't exist before. The soil then becomes richer, the plants more diverse. Even the water runs clearer, filtered by mud and by reed and by the dam. The beaver, without actually knowing it, it's nature's original restorer, a creature that actually makes life possible where there was only hardship before. Interestingly, today, scientists call the beaver a keystone species. Remove it, and the landscape suffers, collapses even. Restore it, and the land is healed. So long before the arrival of Europeans, the beaver was central to the people of North America. The First Nations, Cree, Algonquin, Ojibwe, and countless others understood the rhythms of beaver life. They watched, they learned, they built a partnership with the animal that was both pragmatic and I think also sacred. Beaver fur meant survival. Its warmth a shield, if you like, against winters so cold the air itself seemed to freeze. The meat was eaten. The bones were shaped into tools. But the beaver was also a character in the stories that shaped nations. Wise, patient, sometimes I think mischievous, and always industrious. In Algonquin legend, the beaver brought order to the flood. In Cree tradition, it was a symbol of peace of the family lodge, effectively a model for community and family care. And always there was a sense of stewardship. Use what you need, honor what you take, never, ever overhunt. The beaver was never an object to be spent, but in many ways actually a neighbor to be respected, a balance held, for a time, I think, with care. Now, imagine the land as it stood before the first European sails split the dawn off Newfoundland, a continent veined with rivers dotted with beaver ponds, and the forests actually thrumming with life. This was not wilderness, not untouched, but a world in balance, shaped by countless generations of both beaver and human. Into this uniquely peaceful world come strangers from across the sea. At first, they came for fish. Basque and Breton fishermen hauling cod from the rich banks offshore, their fires burning along the cold Atlantic. But as they ventured inland, their eyes opened to new riches. Beaver fur, thick and luxurious, was a treasure they had not known they were seeking. In the courts of Europe, hats fashioned from beaver felt had become the height of fashion, a symbol of wealth, status, even sanity, and European demand was insatiable. Trade began quietly. Knives, kettles, beads, and cloth exchanged for pelts. The indigenous peoples, already expert trappers, quickly understood the value these strangers placed on beaver fur. At first, the exchange seemed mutually beneficial, goods for goods, knowledge for knowledge. The newcomers brought metal and gunpowder, and the locals brought their understanding of land and season. But as the market in Europe grew, the appetite for pelts turned to hunger and then to a mad obsession. The rivers of North America became the arteries of a new empire. Canoes laden with furs paddled along the Ottawa, the St. Lawrence, the Saskatchewan. The forests echoed with the chop of axes, the splash of paddles, the low, urgent songs of voyagers making their way west, always in search of more. And what followed was not only a story of trade, but a story of power, of alliances, of rivalries, and conflict on a continental scale. Beaver Wars, as they would come to be known, reshaped the map of North America long before a treaty was ever signed or a fort was ever raised. The Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee, rose to dominate the trade routes, determined to control the flow of goods to the Europeans. Muskets traded for pelts gave them an edge over their rivals. Across the Great Lakes, Algonquin, Huron, Ottawa, and others fought for territory, for access, effectively for survival. Old scores were settled with new weapons. Villages rose and fell, and entire peoples were driven from ancient homelands, forced to seek new lives on the shifting edge of empire. And look, it wasn't a simple tale of winners and losers. Sometimes trade brought peace and kinship. Marriage alliances were forged, languages were blended, and customs exchanged. At other times, suspicion and violence flared, and the forest rang with the sound of muskets. The beaver, indifferent to all this human drama, just went about its work. But in the space of a few generations, the animal's world was changed utterly. What had once been a stable partnership, careful hunting, deep respect, became an extinction. Trappers fanned out into the wilderness, setting their traps with ruthless efficiency, driven not by the need, but by the insatiable demand of distant markets. So let's just step into the shoes for a moment of a fur trader standing at a remote post. Moose Factory, Fort Albany, York Factory on the cold shores of Hudson Bay. The air would have smelt of spruce and damp earth and the unmistakable musk of drying pelts. Behind the rough palisade walls, barrels and bales are stacked high, every item counted, every pelt graded by sharp-eyed factors who know the value of a winter skin versus a summer rag. Out of the water, a birch bark canoe arrives, gunnels low, filled with Cree, Algonquin, and other traders. The welcome is brisk but cordial. Trust is hard-won in the north. Ledgers are opened, beads are counted, powder and muskets weighed. There would have been laughter and haggling. There would have also been moments of suspicion, sometimes a smile over a shared drink. And at night, fires would have glowed on the riverbank and stories would have been told. The doings of the French upriver, the coming winter, the return of the salmon, the old legends of the land. In these places, cultures certainly met and mingled. French voyagers, famed for their strength and their songs, paddled the great canoes for months at a stretch. Scotsmen in tartan waistcoats scribbled in ledgers, always mindful of the company's rules. Indigenous women, often the true link between worlds, held families together, kept the camps, and taught the newcomers how to live through the punishing winters. It would have been an incredibly hard life. Blisters, frozen feet, the endless gnaw of hunger and cold. Yet in hardship, a kind of freedom. The sweep of the river, the open sky, the sense of being at the frontier, of making a new world, literally day by day. From these minglings arose a new people, the Métis. Children of fur traders and indigenous women, they grew up on the edge of two worlds, fluent in the languages of both, yet belonging, I suppose, really to neither. As the generations turned, the Métis forged their own identity. Buffalo hunters, cart makers, traders, musicians, diplomats, and of course warriors. They invented the Red River cart, which is a creaking all-wooden marvel that could be disassembled and floated across rivers, hauled by oxen or, at a pinch, by human muscle alone. Their dances, a fusion of fiddle and drum, would have echoed across the prairies. Their flag, a blue or red field marked with the infinity symbol, spoke of continuity, resilience, I suppose also a sense of nationhood rooted in not empire, but in place. The Métis would one day fight to defend their land and rights under Louis Riel at Red River and at Batoche, shaping the destiny of Western Canada in ways that echo to this day. And I think their legacy is not just a chapter of history, but a living testament to the possibility of something new, which arose effectively from collision and compromise and creativity. For more than 2 centuries, the beaver was currency, literally. In the posts and the forts of the Hudson's Bay Company, everything was reckoned in made beavers. A blanket might cost 5 pelts. A musket might cost 20. A bottle of rum, 3. The best pelts were winter skins, dense, glossy, free from the scars of summer living. These could command fortunes, their value set in the distant counting houses of London and Paris. And so the trade grew. The Hudson's Bay Company, chartered in 1670, was granted dominion over the entire watershed of Hudson Bay, a realm vaster than most European kingdoms. For 2 centuries, its directors in London ruled by parchment and wax seal, while their agents in the wild lived by wit, grit, and I have to say, a lot of luck. The company's rules were incredibly strict, but often honored in the breach. There were no swearing, no riotous living, no dueling, although the last, it said, was sometimes overlooked in the dark of winter, where you would hear gunshots going off after the sun set. Yet every season, when the ice broke, the great canoes went out, and the year's catch was sent across the sea, wealth compressed in bales of fur and tallied in ledgers with a Scottish clerk's neat, unwavering hand. But always the shadow grew. The beaver populations declined, first near the posts, then further and further upriver. And by the mid-19th century, in many places, the ponds were empty, the lodges abandoned, and the land had grown silent. An entire ecosystem had been unpicked, and in reality, the web of life unraveled. And here's the thing, the loss wasn't just ecological, but human. The people of the land, the Cree, the Métis, felt the change most keenly. Where once a balance had been kept, now the balance tipped. Hunger would have grown, old ways faltered, and new ways would have been forced on the unwilling. Even in Europe, the change was noticed. Hatters, unable to find good pelts, turned to substitutes. Rabbit, wool. But the difference was keenly felt. The madness of the hatters, driven by mercury used in the felting process, actually became legend in itself, a footnote to the damage that was being wrought half a world away. In North America, the beaver vanished from river after river, pond after pond, and it was only in the most remote, most inhospitable places did it barely hang on, really a ghost of its former abundance. And so, by the time the modern age arrived, with its railways and telegraphs, its flags and borders, the beaver was, for most, a distant memory. But history, as it so often does, offers a second act. In the wilds of Ontario and Quebec, in the boreal heart of the continent, the beaver found a new champion, and his name was Grey Owl, a figure who seems to have stepped from the old legends, yet who belonged in the end to the modern world. Grey Owl was, in truth, Archibald Stansfield Bellany, a man who was actually born in England, who crossed the Atlantic as a young adventurer, and over decades actually remade himself as a voice of the wild. He actually lived as a trapper, then as a park warden, but he wrote with deep passion about the need to save the beaver, not for profit, but for the sake of land itself. His books, Pilgrims of the Wild, Sanjo and the Beaver People, became absolute bestsellers. His lectures drew crowds on both sides of the ocean. In a world infatuated with progress, he actually spoke of the patient, persistent work of nature, for the idea that what had been lost might yet be restored. And when Grey Owl died in 1938, everybody actually thought he was an American Indian, a man of the land. But it was only then that the truth of his origins were actually revealed. And of course, then the backlash was fierce. Yet by then, the work was done. The beaver had allies. And I like to think that the land actually had hope. In the years that followed, the beaver began to return. At first, it was the work of a few die-hard naturalists and game wardens who saw what was missing, and they resolved to put it right. Streams that had run straight and barren now began to meander again. Wetlands returned, almost as if the land remembered what it had once been. In the American West, in California and Idaho, beavers were reintroduced to streams parched by drought and fire. And one of the most audacious efforts, Operation Beaver Drop, saw beavers parachuted in crates into remote mountain meadows, where they wasted no time in getting to work. In Europe, projects to rewild the English and Scottish countryside saw the beaver return to rivers from which it had been absent for centuries. And I have to say, the results were dramatic. Where the beaver returned, so did life. Fish, frogs, otters, kingfishers, wildflowers, they all returned. And the land grew resilient, able to, I suppose, withstand floods and fire, and to endure drought. Farmers, ranchers, city dwellers too, began to see the value not in what could be taken, but in what could be restored. I think today the beaver is no longer merely a curiosity. It is, once again, an actor in the ongoing story of land and people. A symbol, perhaps, of what might be possible if patience and persistence are given their due. Urban beavers, I can't help but laugh, make headlines, building dams in city parks and golf courses, and sometimes to the delight of residents, sometimes to their consternation. In places like Scotland, farmers argue over flooded fields and toppled trees. In California, ranchers debate the merits of beaver dams for keeping streams running in the dry months. But beneath the squabbles and the headlines, something deeper stirs. I think a recognition that the beaver, in all its stubborn, ingenious glory, is not just a builder, but a teacher. Imagine that. A beaver that teaches. It reminds us, I think, that the world can actually be changed. Slowly, steadily, in the face of odds that seem insurmountable. that what is lost is not always gone forever, that the work of, I suppose, restoration, the work of dam building is never finished, never easy, but always worth doing. Step now into the beaver's world, and not as an observer, guys, but as a fellow traveler. Imagine slipping into the cold, pea brown water as dusk settles and the air sharpens with autumn's breath. The world is sound, a kingfisher's call, the distant crack of antlers in the bush, and the careless drip and rush of moving water. The beaver is actually at home here in a way that defies mere survival. Each action, chopping a willow, dragging a sapling, packing mud with its clever paws, I think it's both necessary and legacy. Generations have worked this same pond, sculpting and resculpting, never for glory, but because this is what it means to belong. If you then follow a beaver through the underwater entrance of its lodge, the world actually changes. Inside, it's quiet, safe, a bubble of warmth, and scent and breadth of sleeping kits. This is a home built against the odds in a land that can freeze steel solid, and yet it's remade each spring by this indomitable creature. But I think what's interesting is the beaver's work shapes not just home, but history. Centuries ago, voyagers would judge a waterway by the health of its beaver ponds. And some of these beaver lodges were over a mile long. Can you imagine that? Dams that would stand so strong that would then create fortunes for the fur brigade. In letters and ledgers, in stories whispered at campfires, and in the journals of men and women who actually lived and died by the rhythm of that trade, the beaver was always more than an animal. It was a sign, a promise, and a warning. Where there are beavers, there is life. And I think to understand the scale of the beaver's influence through history, you have to enter the ledger-strewn boardrooms of London and the ice-bound forts of Rupert's Land. In 1670, when King Charles II granted the Hudson's Bay Company its charter, he handed over a realm of almost unimaginable reach, an empire that was measured in rivers and forests and fur-laden breadths of countless beavers. This was the birth of corporate empire and the blueprint for so much that would follow in the British world: commerce, colonization, and of course conflict. The company itself was an institution of paradox. In London, gentlemen counted dividends and debated policy, probably over a glass of sherry. On the Bay, factors and traders carved out lives of hardship and opportunity and married into the local indigenous populations. They learned the languages of the land and enforced a code that mixed English law with the fierce justice of the wild. The forts themselves were like small cities, microcosms of empire. They were stores and blacksmiths, chapels and dance halls, even gardens, painstakingly hacked from the northern soil. Winters would have been endless darkness, near absolute. Yet life went on. Birth, feasts, festivals, betrayals. The year's greatest event was actually the arrival of the ship from England, which would have been packed with letters and luxury goods and the latest hats from Bond Street and the all-important trade goods to be swapped for beaver pelts. Yet even here, change crept in. The arrival of the Northwest Company, which was bold and brash and Montreal-based, ignited decades of rivalry that split towns and rivers, sometimes spilling into open violence. Where there was profit, there was always conflict. And where there was conflict, the beaver found itself squeezed even harder. Amid the whirl of empire and commerce, the deeper stories endured. For the Anishinaabe, the beaver is Amik, the wise worker, the patient guide. In the Haudenosaunee, great law of peace, the beaver's wisdom is invoked as a model for statesmanship and diplomacy. Among the Cree and the Dene, elders remember how the beaver shaped not only the land, but the very fabric of their societies, how to read the water, how to travel with the seasons, how to honor the balance between taking and giving. In the old stories, beaver is both trickster and benefactor. Some say the great rivers were made by the beaver's tail. Some tell of how, when the world was drowning, it was the beaver who dove to the bottom, bringing up the first clod of mud from which land would be formed. The lessons are not lost: perseverance, integrity, community. In the present, Indigenous communities continue to lead beaver restoration, viewing it not only as environmental stewardship, but as cultural renewal, a recognition of language, land, and the teachings of their ancestors. Beaver teachings find their way certainly into classrooms and into movements to reclaim waterways sacred by neglect. There is also a haunting emptiness to the landscape after the beavers are gone. Settlers who actually arrived in the 19th century wrote of prairies so dry that dust blew in endless storms, of rivers cutting deeper, flooding hard and vanishing to nothing in drought, marshes dried, grasslands shriveled, fires swept unchecked, and what would have been 1,000 songs fell silent. The ecological collapse echoed in human tragedy. Communities that depended on beaver fur and wetland bounty found themselves adrift. The Métis, caught between the worlds of their parents, faced dispossession and war. And the great trading companies, once fat on beaver, looked elsewhere for profit, or simply faded into history's long dusk. By 1900, the beaver, once numbering in the tens of millions across North America, survived only in remote corners, a shadow of its former self. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists began to truly understand the magnitude of what was lost. As biologists and hydrologists, studied the role of beavers, they found something almost miraculous. Where beaver returned, biodiversity followed. Streams slowed and spread, droughts eased, wildfires lost their power at wetland edges. Migrating birds returned. Salmon, long absent, spawned again in gravel beds restored by beaver dams. So beaver were not merely inhabitants, they were engineers reshaping the very charter of continents. The emerging science of ecosystem engineering put the beaver at its heart. From the American West to the Scottish Highlands, the return of the beaver literally became not only, I think, an environmental story, but a political and a social one. Ranchers and conservationists, city managers and school children, I think, each found their own meaning in the beaver's comeback. Of course, as we know, coexistence is never simple. Beavers, after all, are not sentimental. They flood roads, they chew through valuable orchards, they topple ornamental trees, and of course, they also frustrate engineers who like rivers to obey, a particular straight line. The beaver deceiver, a clever device to manage water levels, was actually invented not by a bureaucrat, but by those who understood that living with beavers means meeting them halfway. The beaver deceiver. That conjures up all sorts of things. In California's Central Valley, ranchers now lobby for beaver reintroduction to fight drought. I mean, who would have thought? In Devon and Scotland, farmers protest, but then sometimes come round when they see a field that turns green again. Urban beavers in the Bronx and Berlin have become folk heroes, literally stars of local news. Reminders that even in cities, wilderness endures. Yet for every headline about conflict, there are absolutely dozens of quiet victories. A pond where school children release ducklings, a restored marsh where rare orchids bloom, a summer evening where a beaver, unhurried, swims through water. I like to think alive with possibility. It's absolutely remarkable when you think on it, how the beaver has woven itself into the heart of Canada, into the identity of a nation that so often defines itself by endurance, pragmatism, and quiet, stubborn hope. The beaver is actually stamped on the nickel. It's painted on regimental colors and remembered in the names of towns and rivers, and perhaps most of all, in the stories that parents tell their children when they're sitting at the water's edge. Yet the beaver story, I have to say, it's not only Canadian, nor is it only North American. In the 21st century, as the world faces drought, flood, and the unpredictable tremors of climate, the beaver's lesson, I think, seems both ancient and urgent. And I think that message is if we build together and change slowly, we can leave the world richer than when we found it. So, just to end this episode, folks, let us return one last time to that pond at dusk. The air is cool, the water still carries the memory of centuries. A beaver, ancient and new, swims the familiar channel towards its lodge. The ripple it leaves behind is a kind of history, fleeting yet real, proof that the world is changed not by conquest or decree, but by the endless ancient work of living things. As darkness falls, a lodge stands solid, warm against the coming winter. Inside, a family stirs. Outside the pond, alive with frogs, ringed by wildflowers, thick with the scent of green and growing things, it offers its quiet, ongoing testimony. And I think that testimony is that here is history made night after night, stick by stick, by a creature who knows only that home is worth building again and again, no matter how many times the world is undone by humans. Thanks for listening in, folks. Bye for now.